The heavy metal car keys slammed onto the granite counter, sliding right past my coffee mug and nearly knocking it to the floor. Outside the Phoenix, sun was already baking the asphalt into a shimmering haze, but inside my mother's kitchen, the air was freezing. My older brother Miguel stood there smirking, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive linen shirt. He had taken my only vehicle without asking the night before, driven it across the city, and brought it back with a deep, jagged scratch running the entire length of the passenger door. The gas gauge was completely on empty. I asked him what he had done to my car. He stepped forward, snatching the keys back off the counter. Before I could even brace myself, he shoved his open palm hard into my shoulder. My feet slipped on the polished tile. My lower back slammed into the sharp edge of the kitchen island. Pain shot straight up my spine, stealing the breath from my lungs. "Are you crazy?" he sneered, towering over me. "Throwing yourself into furniture to play the victim. My driving that piece of trash is the only honor it has ever had. Stop being dramatic. No wonder your husband left you." A few feet away, the rhythmic chopping of a chef's knife continued without missing a single beat. My mother Arabella was slicing tomatoes for a salad. She kept her eyes glued to the wooden cutting board, completely ignoring the violent thud of my body hitting the wood. "Stop making a scene," she muttered, her tone completely flat and hollow. "Your brother is stressed about work. You are giving everyone a headache over a few minor scratches." I swallowed the metallic taste of blood from biting the inside of my cheek. I locked my trembling knees and stood up straight, forcing my breathing to steady. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to apologize and absorb the abuse just to keep their perfect family illusion intact. My physical pain was nothing but an inconvenience to their morning routine. Right there, leaning against the cold granite, a switch flipped in my chest. The era of keeping the peace was permanently over. The war had silently begun. I am Sandra. I am 35 years old, an operations manager who spends 50 hours a week fixing broken corporate systems and routing millions of dollars in corporate infrastructure. Yet my own family system was the one thing I kept trying to survive instead of fix. Before the throbbing in my lower back even settled, my phone started buzzing on the counter. Then it buzzed again and again. The screen lit up with a flood of notifications from our extended family group chat. Miguel had not even pulled his own luxury sedan out of the driveway, but he was already executing his strategy. He had preemptively texted my aunts, uncles, and cousins. He told them I just had a hysterical breakdown over a tiny scratch on my bumper. He claimed I threw myself against a counter in a fit of rage. He told them he was seriously worried about my mental stability. My aunt replied immediately, telling me I needed to apologize to him because he worked too hard to deal with my drama. My own phone glowed with a dozen messages from relatives telling me to get professional help to stop stressing my mother to be grateful. I had a successful brother who tolerated me. He spun the lie so flawlessly I was convicted before I even knew there was a trial. They thought isolating me would break my spirit. They thought painting me as unstable would force me to crawl back and beg for their approval. They had no idea that isolation just gave me the dead silence I needed to finally see them clearly. A few days later, the family hosted a massive barbecue at a lavish country club in uptown Phoenix. The desert heat pressed down heavily on the manicured green lawns, mixing with the smell of expensive charcoal chlorine from the pool and cheap gossip. My 9-year-old son Steven stood near the edge of the stone patio by the dessert spread. He was a brilliant boy. He could wire a motherboard in his sleep and build complex mechanical toys from spare parts. But his severe reading delays made him an easy target for a family that only valued perfect marketable report cards. Steven reached out for a chocolate cupcake, a cupcake I had bought and paid for with my own money. Before his small fingers even brushed the frosting, Miguel's arms swung down like a whip. The loud, sharp smack of skin on skin echoed over the patio music. He viciously slapped my son's hand away. The pastry tumbled into the pristine grass, instantly crushed beneath Miguel's polished leather loafer. Miguel raised his voice, making absolutely sure the entire patio of wealthy guests and relatives was listening. "These are for kids with actual futures," he announced. "Kids who are actually going to elite colleges. Slow, illiterate kids like you are just a waste of money. Pick it up from the dirt or get out." Steven flinched, shrinking into himself, cradling his stinging red hand against his chest. I lunged forward, my fingernails digging so deep into my own palms, the skin nearly broke. A heavy arm blocked my path. My father, Hayden. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his imported beer, wiping the condensation from the glass with a casual flick of his wrist. "Leave it alone," my father warned, his voice thick with casual disappointment. "He is teaching the boy a lesson about earning his keep. You need to focus on his failing grades instead of disrespecting your brother in public." I pulled Stephen against my side, pressing his trembling shoulders to my hip. For years, I believed my endurance bought us safety. I believed if I just took the hits, they would eventually love us. Looking at the crushed cake in the dirt, the brutal, sickening truth finally snapped into focus. They did not just hate me, they hated my child. And the piece I was bleeding to keep was nothing but a weapon they used to hunt him. The country club staff had already started clearing the tables by the time the sun began to dip behind the desert mountains. Empty champagne flutes and crumpled linen napkins littered the patio. The heat was still brutal, baking the flagstone beneath my feet. Miguel had vanished towards the clubhouse bar with his friends, leaving his oversized leather messenger bag draped carelessly over a wrought iron chair. He expected me to pack it in my trunk, drive it across town, and deliver it to his apartment. That was my role, the loyal, silent pack mule. I grabbed the thick leather strap to heave the bag off the chair. The main zipper hung open. A heavy, high-gloss presentation folder slid out, hitting the stone deck with a sharp, heavy smack. Thick, bold letters stamped across the glossy cover stared up at me. Future Leaders Innovation Grant. Proposal for corporate funding. $500,000. I crouched down and flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. The breath completely left my lungs. Right there, printed on crisp corporate letterhead, was a technical schematic. It was a high-resolution scan of blue grid paper, Stephen's grid paper. Every uneven pencil line, every precise measurement, every tiny smudged erasure mark was perfectly visible. It was the exact blueprint for the moisture sensor project my 9-year-old son had spent 4 agonizing months designing on our kitchen floor. Miguel had visited my house the previous week. He took the notebook straight off Stephen's desk. He claimed he knew a high school science teacher who could look at the messy wiring and help the boy fix it. The pages underneath the blueprints detailed a corporate pitch for Miguel's tutoring company. The proposal claimed Miguel himself had engineered the prototype. He called it a proprietary corporate asset. He called it the crown jewel of his genius. He completely erased my son from the narrative. My hands began to tremble, rattling the thick pages against each other. He stole the intellectual property of the exact same child he had just publicly humiliated for being slow. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind me. Miguel strolled back onto the patio, swirling an iced cocktail in his hand. He stopped, his eyes dropping to the open folder in my grip. His expression remained entirely blank. He just took a slow sip of his drink, the ice clinking against the glass, and smiled a wide, brilliant, sociopathic smile. "Looking for a handout?" he asked, stepping into the shade. I held up the blueprints, the paper shaking in my grip. "This is Stephen's project. You stole his work." He rolled his eyes, letting out a loud theatrical sigh, as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum. "Oh, grow up, Sandra. Do you honestly think a boardroom full of Phoenix billionaires is going to hand $500,000 to a retarded kid's drawing?" He stepped closer, jabbing a manicured finger at the folder. "I am doing this family a massive favor by turning that garbage into actual gold. I am giving it a real brand. You and your son should be on your knees, thanking me for giving his little arts and crafts project a purpose." He took another sip of his drink, completely unbothered, and waited for my usual reaction. He waited for me to cry, to beg, to shout, or to run to our parents for a fairness that never existed. My teeth clamped together so hard my jaw ached. The burning, frantic desperation to be respected by this man instantly evaporated. The sister who spent 35 years craving her family's validation died right there on the sun-baked patio. A cold, absolute clarity took her place. I was no longer an angry sister. I was a systematic executioner. I carefully closed the folder, smoothing out the glossy cover, and slid it back into his leather bag. My voice dropped to a dead, hollow whisper. "You are absolutely right, Miguel," I said, handing him the bag. "It is going to be a brilliant pitch." Monday morning arrived. I walked into Miguel's pristine corner office in the financial district. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, adjusting a silk tie in his reflection. I kept my shoulders slumped, playing the exact role he expected. The beaten, compliant sister. He did not even look at me when I spoke. "You were right about the project," I said, staring at the plush carpet. "You know how to sell it better than I ever could." He smirked, shooting his cuffs. Glad you finally woke up to reality. It takes a certain breed to handle the big leagues. Then, I handed him the bait. Just a technical tip for the pitch tomorrow, I said, placing a sleek silver flash drive on his mahogany desk. The angel investors love embedded tech. Do not just show them the glossy folder. Take this drive, the one Stephen loaded the raw data on, and plug it directly into the boardroom's main screen during your presentation. It shows them the raw code running live. It makes you look like an absolute genius. His eyes lit up with pure, unadulterated greed. He snatched the drive off the wood. He thought I was surrendering to his dominance. He never realized I was handing him the rope. Tuesday afternoon. The glass-walled boardroom in uptown Phoenix was packed with the city's wealthiest venture capitalists. I stood quietly in the back corner, blending into the shadows near the exit doors. Miguel stood at the mahogany podium completely in his element, preaching about his proprietary genius and his brilliant vision for the future of education. The investors leaned forward, nodding, captivated by his polished charisma. "Let me show you the raw architecture," he announced, holding up the silver drive like a trophy. He jammed it into the podium's main port. The massive LED screen spanning the front wall went pitch black. The corporate logo vanished. Suddenly, a high-definition video blared through the room. 9-year-old Stephen sat at our kitchen table, a soldering iron in his small hand, carefully connecting the exact circuit board Miguel claimed to have invented. A massive, blood-red watermark flashed across the footage, locking onto the screen. Intellectual property of Stephen, stolen by Miguel. The investors gasped. A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the room. Miguel's face lost every drop of color. Sweat instantly beaded on his forehead. His hands shook violently as he slammed his palms against the keyboard, frantically hammering the keys. The video kept looping, the red letters burning into the screen. He reached under the podium and violently yanked the cord straight out of the wall. The screen finally died. "A hacker," he screamed, his voice cracking into a high, desperate pitch. "It is a cyber attack from a competitor. The company is still perfectly solvent. Look, I can prove our liquidity right now." He was drowning, thrashing for a lifeline. He ripped his metal black card from his wallet and jammed it into the investor portal terminal on the podium, desperate to project his personal capital on the backup screen to prove his wealth. Over the weekend, I had made exactly 2 clicks on my laptop. I routed the corporate charity accounts, the exact same accounts he routinely drained for country club tabs and luxury vacations, directly into a federal tax honeypot. It triggered an automatic, irrevocable money laundering freeze across all his associated financial profiles. The terminal beeped a harsh, flat tone. The backup projector snapped to life, casting a giant, glaring error message across Miguel's pale, trembling face. Card declined. Assets frozen by federal authorities. The investors grabbed their phones. They snapped their briefcases shut and walked straight toward the exit, pushing past me without a second glance. Miguel stood frozen at the podium, his mouth hanging open, utterly destroyed by his own arrogance. The heavy glass doors of the uptown Phoenix high-rise slid open, letting the blistering desert air bleed into the air-conditioned lobby. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the harsh glare of the afternoon sun bounced off the hoods of 3 Federal Economic Task Force cruisers. A federal tax honeypot tripwire does not generate a polite warning email. It generates badges. Heavy boots clattered against the marble floors. 2 agents bypassed the reception desk and stepped straight into the private elevator bank, heading directly for the boardroom. Before the elevator doors even chimed shut, the revolving doors spun violently. My parents, Hayden and Arabella, rushed into the lobby. They were dressed in their absolute best. My father wore a pressed linen suit, and my mother clutched a chilled bottle of imported champagne. They had come to toast the golden child's $500,000 coronation. Instead, they walked into the wreckage. They spotted the flashing lights outside. They watched the panicked investors flooding into the lobby, whispering furiously into their phones about frozen assets and corporate fraud. Then they saw me standing quietly by a marble pillar. The habitual arrogance completely melted off their faces, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. They practically sprinted across the lobby. "Sandra," my mother gasped. She grabbed my forearm, her manicured nails digging deep into my skin. She dropped the champagne. The heavy bottle shattered on the marble floor, sending a foaming mess of expensive alcohol and green glass across our shoes. "Do something. Tell them it is a system error. He is your brother." My father shoved his way forward, his face flushed, crimson, thick drops of sweat beading on his forehead. "You run the operations. You have the clearance code, Sandra. Fix this right now. You cannot let them take him. Think of the family. I stared at the panic sweat dripping down my father's face. I looked at my mother's shaking hands. For 35 years, I had craved their protection. For 35 years, they had demanded I shrink myself, silence my pain, and sacrifice my son's dignity to keep their false peace intact. Now, when the bill finally arrived for their precious son, they expected me to throw myself in front of the train to save him. I calmly reached down and peeled my mother's fingers off my arm, dropping her hand back to her side. My voice was flat, hollow, and perfectly steady. "You were right, Mom," I said, locking eyes with her. "Cupcakes are only for those with a future." I shifted my gaze to my father, watching his jaw tremble. For thieves and embezzlers, their future is in a cell. I turned my back on them. I walked straight through the shattered glass and the spilled champagne. I pushed through the heavy lobby doors and stepped out into the blazing Phoenix sun. Behind me, my mother shrieked Miguel's name as the agents escorted him out of the elevator in handcuffs. I kept walking. I found my scratched car in the parking garage. I rolled the windows down, letting the hot desert wind blast through the cabin, and drove home. Stephen was sitting at the kitchen table sketching a new circuit board on a fresh pad of grid paper. I walked in and placed a white bakery box right in the center of the table. I flipped the lid open. 6 perfect chocolate cupcakes sat inside. No reservations, no hierarchy. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A barrage of frantic calls flooded the family group chat. I pulled the device out, tapped the block button, and tossed the phone straight into the trash can. Stephen reached out and took a cupcake. I took one too. The frosting was sweet and the apartment was perfectly, beautifully silent. The gavel did not fall immediately. The justice system is agonizingly slow, but it is absolute. 7 months after the boardroom ambush, a federal judge in downtown Phoenix handed down the final sentence. Miguel was convicted of 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of embezzling nonprofit funds. The judge sentenced him to 46 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The court also ordered restitution of $85,000, the exact amount he had quietly drained from the corporate charity accounts to fund his luxury country club lifestyle. But the legal ruin was only half of the collapse. The social execution was far more ruthless. The elite Phoenix Country Club, the very place where Miguel had crushed my son's cupcake into the dirt, permanently revoked my parents' membership. The tutoring company board fired Miguel the very next morning, dissolving his shares to settle the massive lawsuits from the defrauded investors. My parents, desperate to save their golden child from a public defender, mortgaged their retirement home to pay for a high-powered defense attorney. They lost the house anyway. They traded their lavish desert estate for a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city. Their wealthy friends stopped returning their phone calls. The community did not pity them. They became a cautionary tale of blind arrogance. 11 months later, the mail carrier dropped a plain white envelope into my mailbox. It had a federal correctional facility return address. I stood in my kitchen, the Arizona afternoon sun pouring through the window, and sliced the heavy paper open. It was 3 pages of cramped, furious handwriting. Miguel offered 0 apologies. He spent the first page blaming me for destroying the family legacy. He spent the second page claiming he only took the money to keep the business afloat for all of us. He spent the third page weaponizing our mother, claiming her health was failing and demanding I put money into his commissary account to relieve her burden. 5 years ago, a letter like that would have sent me into a frantic spiral of guilt. I would have drafted a dozen replies, desperately trying to make him understand the pain he caused. This time, my heart rate remained completely steady. My hands did not shake. I folded the 3 pages in half, walked over to the paper shredder, and fed the letter straight into the metal teeth. I tossed the shredded remains into the trash, wiped down the granite counters, and went back to making dinner. The silence was no longer a punishment. It was my fortress. We built a beautiful new life in the massive space they left behind. I opened a small operations consulting firm, working with local businesses who actually valued my expertise, instead of hiding me in a back room to protect a fragile ego. Stephen blossomed. Without the constant suffocating weight of my family's judgment, his anxiety completely melted away. We found a retired electrical engineer in our neighborhood named Marcus. Marcus did not care about Stephen's reading speed. He looked at my son and saw a brilliant mechanical mind. Marcus became the grandfather Stephen actually deserved, spending hours in the garage, teaching him how to solder complex motherboards. Last weekend, we hosted our own barbecue at a public park on the edge of the city. There were no country club dress codes, no imported champagnes, and no reserved tables for future leaders. Just Marcus, a few close friends, and the families of the kids Steven built robots with. I watched my son run across the grass, laughing loudly, his hands covered in sticky barbecue sauce. Nobody measured his worth by a test score. He was just allowed to be a child. The people sitting around our picnic tables were not tied to us by blood. They were tied to us by mutual respect. A family tree is completely useless if the roots are poisoned. You have to chop it down and plant something that can actually grow. If you are watching this and you have spent your entire life shrinking yourself to fit into a family that only loves you when you are silent, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The architecture of a toxic family does not run on the abuser alone. It runs entirely on the enablers. Miguel's narcissism was not a solo act. It required the massive infrastructure of my parents' complicity. Enablers will watch you bleed, and instead of stopping the person holding the knife, they will cover your mouth so your screams do not disturb the neighbors. They will tell you to keep the peace, but you must understand this deeply. The person who demands you keep the peace while you are being attacked is not a peacemaker. They are an accomplice to the violence. They are sacrificing you to buy their own comfort. For 35 years, I believed my endurance was a virtue. I believed if I just took the hits, if I just worked harder, if I just absorbed the financial burdens, they would eventually see my value. That is the greatest lie we tell ourselves. Tolerating abuse does not make you morally superior. It does not earn you a medal. It simply hands toxic people a detailed manual on exactly how much they can get away with. People will tell you that karma is a natural force, that the universe will eventually balance the scales. But waiting for the universe to serve justice is a trauma response. It is a way to avoid the terrifying responsibility of standing up for yourself. Sometimes karma does not have a tracking number. Sometimes you have to forge the stamp, write the address, and deliver the heavy bill yourself. You are allowed to walk away from people who hurt you, even if you share a last name. Blood does not make you family. Loyalty, respect, and safety do. When a family asks you to preserve the peace by sacrificing your own dignity or the dignity of your child, that peace is absolutely not worth keeping. Have you ever had to become the villain in someone else's story just to protect your own peace? Have you ever had to walk away from the table because they refused to save you a seat? Drop a 100 in the comments if you have ever had to cut off toxic family and share this story with someone. Who needs the strength to pack up and walk away today? My name is Sandra, and for the first time in my life, I am completely free.